Thanks, Rodwan, for having me. Um, so let me not mince words. Let's get right to the point. I think that the Biden administration is the worst U.S. administration on democracy in the Middle East since the 1980s, with the partial exception of the Trump administration for obvious reasons. But I think it is worth just really emphasizing what an unusual administration this is in terms of the expectations they raised about prioritizing democracy and moving in a more positive direction. And they have done some of that in other regions of the world. The Middle East is an almost complete exception to this pro-democracy strategy. So I think there's two ways of reacting to this unfortunate fact. We can think about short-term options, and we've discussed some of them already, and I think there still is time to act, and anything is possible. And we can imagine a scenario where some in the Biden administration can be persuaded to do more than they've been doing. And I'll say a couple things about that, and then I'll move on to the medium to long term, because I think that, there's a good chance Tunisia will continue its slide towards dictatorship. And then we have to think about what the long-term possibilities are and how to steel ourselves for that longer battle for democracy. So short term, we've touched on it, but I want to really put a fine point on it. There is one incredibly powerful piece of leverage. But for this to work, the US and its European partners would have to act almost immediately. Time really is running out, and that's the IMF loan. And just yesterday, the IMF's managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, said, quote unquote, that she expects to see in the next weeks, not months, a conclusion of the remaining actions so we can go to the board for the final agreement. So as some of you might know, the provisional agreement was in October, but they've been working through a number of outstanding issues. And as of yesterday, we're talking about the IMF loan actually being finalized in the matter of weeks, which is to say, for any of you who are on this call, who have any, relationships, friendships, and connections with people, IMF, World Bank, the US, this is probably the time to act. Now, the US is very important here. In the IMF Articles of Agreement, there is nothing about political conditionality. The IMF is empowered to work with both democracies and autocracies. So that's the way it is. But there's nothing in the Articles of Agreement that say that political concerns can't be used in considering whether or not a loan goes through. And in fact, the irony of this is that the IMF and the World Bank, when Egypt was very briefly a flawed democracy in 2013, in effect, suspended talks for a loan agreement because Mohamed Morsi, the first elected president of Egypt, whatever else you think about him, wasn't being inclusive enough. So when Egypt was moving in a democratic direction, the IMF insisted on political conditionality. When Egypt became a dictatorship, all of that went away, and the IMF jumped to support Sisi. Just think about the irony there. And let's also talk about the numbers in Egypt, then I'll come back to Tunisia. From 2016 to 2022, the IMF has given Egypt more than $20 billion of loans. And then 2023, the new IMF agreement is another $3 billion. This is a massive amount of money. And I think we should just say it outright. The IMF is not just perceived as supporting dictators in the Middle East. It is an active enabler and subsidizer of dictatorship. It is playing a nefarious role, and it's clear for everyone to see. And we should no longer treat the IMF and the World Bank as sort of neutral above the fray actors. They are pro-authoritarian in a very explicit way in the Middle East, and they have allowed the Sisi regime to stabilize itself and to consolidate its power in a very difficult economic situation. Now, the current IMF deal that is about to go through in Tunisia, how much are we talking about here? It's $1.9 billion for 48 months. Tunisia has about 1/10 of the population of Egypt. So if we think about what the equivalent is, it is akin to a $20 billion IMF loan to Egypt, but in 2 years, not 6. So in some ways, on a per capita basis, this is an incredibly large IMF bailout. So what do we do with all that information? The US and European countries are the IMF's largest shareholders. It is not traditional practice, but it is entirely possible and within the Biden administration's power to use its voting rights in the IMF to compel IMF officials to pause on these final talks. It can be done. It's doable. There's nothing preventing the US, ideally with coordination with European countries, from considering this maximal option. Because what I do think we need is the maximal option. I'm all for what my fellow panelists have suggested. They can help along the margins, maybe even more than that. But in terms of actually compelling a change of behavior, because, in a very basic level, Tunisia needs this emergency bailout. It's in very dire economic straits. It is at the risk of a historic default. Now, do I have much hope that Kais Saied is a rational actor? No, I don't. What I do have hope, and what I very much believe to be the case, is that Kais Saied's allies understand how important it is to receive this IMF support. And the goal then should be to isolate Saied and to try to peel off his allies in the military, in the security services. And the military, as we've been talking about in Tunisia, has become politicized. It has played an active role in consolidating this new authoritarian state. And they're the ones that we should be thinking more and more about. Okay, so that's on that. On US aid, the bilateral aid, which we've also talked about, and as Eric and others have said, it has been cut in half. I am actually not a big proponent of halfway measures on US aid. And in some ways, I think it's a wash. I don't even see it really as progress, because when you cut aid by half, but there's still a lot of aid continuing, it is quite literally the definition of a mixed message. We tried a partial aid suspension in Egypt after the massacre in 2013. It had no effect, and rightfully so, because Sisi understood what a partial aid suspension is. It's a weak measure. It shows that the US, its heart isn't in it. It wants to give the illusion of doing something on democracy, but isn't willing to follow through on its commitment to any logical end. And with partial aid cuts, they don't actually last long, because they're usually not effective, because they don't, because the message isn't clear and the conditions aren't clear. And anyway, more can be said on that, but I am skeptical of how useful that's going to be, which is, since last year, I've been calling more explicitly, including in an op-ed in the Post with Sharon quite a while ago now, that a full aid suspension has to be considered as a last-ditch measure. Now, you might say, well, then what happens if the Tunisians don't bend and then we have a breach in the relationship? This is always the thinking, though, that we use when it comes to Middle East dictators. So whenever we talk about a full suspension of military assistance to Saudi Arabia, which I've also been an advocate for, we could ground the Saudi military in the matter of weeks if we did a full immediate suspension of spare parts and maintenance, because they wouldn't be able to run their jets and tanks without that after a certain period of time. Well, then people would say, well, what if the Saudis refuse to bend to whatever demands we might have? Then we're stuck. There is a risk when you use leverage, and we should be forthright about that. But at a fundamental level, these regimes need us much more than we need them. And for us to always act like we're the ones who are the weaker party, that we're the ones who are so afraid of what might happen, when we are the ones who provide a security umbrella to many of these Arab dictatorships. We subsidize their repression. It's really worth emphasizing that this is not about neutrality. And in Tunisia today, as Monica said, we are subsidizing the very units, the very agencies and departments that are actively repressing their own people as we speak. The last thing I'll just say on in broader terms, as I close here, Tunisia was where it was supposed to work. And we've alluded to this. It's not the main topic of this conversation, but it is worth remembering that one of the reasons we were optimistic about Tunisia was that the Islamist party there and Nahda did pretty much everything you could imagine to make concessions to secular and liberal parties. It gave up most of its ideological commitments, so much so that its rank and file was grumbling and has been grumbling for many years now. And the bet that the Nahda leadership made was that if they do this, if they try to be as conciliatory as possible to other Tunisian political actors, that this would be a way to safeguard the democratic transition. I was skeptical of that approach, and actually Sharon and I wrote a pretty long paper that came out in 2020. It's called The Dark Side of Consensus in Tunisia. If any of you want to check it out on Brookings website and get the full argument. But there was a dark side to what was happening, which was everything was about consensus. Everything was about a national unity government. It led to a lot of gridlock. And that, in part, is what allowed Kais Saied to come and say, the establishment isn't getting anything done. Look, they just care about staying in power, their own political interests. But still, Ennahda deserves a lot of credit for what it tried to do, and I understood and understand why they chose that course. But if Ennahda's approach didn't actually work, and the Brotherhood's much more aggressive, confrontational approach in Egypt didn't work, it is an interesting question. Like, what are these political parties and movements supposed to do if everything they tried seems to lead to a similar result? But that's really why Tunisia, still is a chance. And I think that's a big part of why there should be renewed focus right now at this very moment from anyone who cares, from anyone who's interested, to actually try to maybe not restore democracy altogether, but to try to right the path, to get Tunisia on a path where it's at least moving in a better direction. And the last thing I'll say is there is a lot of work for the opposition to do in Tunisia. This is a bigger conversation, but one of the major roadblocks is that the opposition forces, they agree on one thing, that they don't like Kais Saied, but because of an Islamist secular divide, to oversimplify a little bit, but because there is still profound distrust, particularly towards Ennahda, that there's an inability for them to come up with a roadmap. So I've often gotten this question from interlocutors in the US government and elsewhere that, okay, Shadi, what is the alternative to Kais Saied? We don't even know what the opposition wants. They haven't presented a clear path forward. They don't even agree on basic things about returning to the previous parliament. And at some level, there has to be a renewed focus on the part of the Tunisian opposition to find a way to unite their ranks and to transcend what has hobbled them for the last 10 years to one degree or another, which is this divide and this distrust of Ennahda, and what I think is a kind of paranoid and unjustified fear of Ennahda. How do you do that? What can Ennahda do to reassure its potential partners? How can civil society organizations here in the US and elsewhere who work in the Middle East, how can they try to encourage their secular counterparts, secular civil society, secular political parties, to try to find a way to work more effectively with Ennahda? These are all things that I think we're going to have to think very seriously about going forward. So I'll end there. Thank you.